Hello and welcome to this webinar on the 2025 Advocacy Priorities for the American Thoracic Society. My name is Gary Ewart, and I am Chief of Advocacy and Government Relations for the American Thoracic Society. And I've had the pleasure of working for the American Thoracic Society for just shy of 30 years. And I need to make an apology to our international members. Today's discussion will focus primarily on domestic U.S. Advocacy policy, and we will likely not be touching on international issues. Today we'll hear from two of my favorite people in the ATS family, Dr. Irina Petrache, the President of the American Thoracic Society, and she'll be talking about the ATS's commitment to advocacy in lung health through domestic advocacy. I'll be sharing with you the priorities of the American Thoracic Society looking at the Trump administration. And I'm pleased that my friend and colleague, Dr. Mary Rice, past chair of the Environmental Health Policy Committee during the first Trump administration, will talk about her experience representing the ATS, both as a committee chairman and up on Capitol Hill and fighting for clean air and addressing a healthy climate. So let me turn over to Dr. Petrache. First, I want to ask you, Dr. Petrache, a question about your views on advocacy and government relations during the coming Trump administration.
Thank you, Gary. And you can address me by my first name. I want to thank everyone for tuning in on this important discussion about domestic policy and how ATS is going to get engaged in this space. We believe strongly in our ability to affect change. And the ATS has been, since its inception, advocating for all our members and the patients that we serve. And we did that on all levels of U.S. Federal government, from U.S. administration, U.S. Congress, and the courts. We are actively advocating for physicians, scientists, and health professionals of the ATS. In a moment, for everyone, Gary is going to discuss the details as to what ATS is legally permitted to engage in as a 501c3 organization, charitable organization that has to abide by IRS rules in this regard. Going back to the topic, of course, many people, many members have voiced their concern about the discourse and the proposed policies and positions related to the Trump administration's proposals. What the ATS remains quite committed to do is, just like we have done with every U.S. president and every administration over the past 30 years, is to carefully review the proposed legislation through the lens of the mission and membership values of ATS, and to look at the legislation, the budgets that the U.S. Congress is proposing, the changes by federal agencies which are pertinent to our work in their rules and regulations and policy. And when appropriate, we will work with our members and coalition groups to really advocate our position on very solid scientific grounds as our basis. What we will not do, we will not issue public statements that are performative, ones that may engage in arguments over social media, and that are really peripheral to, again, the focus and the mission of our organization. I want everyone to keep in mind that our Washington, D.C. office is quite mighty, but it is small. We have 3 staff superbly engaged and that are essential to our advocacy efforts. And we also have dedicated physicians and researchers who serve on our policy and advocacy committees that we draw on their expertise and their passion about engaging in this space as appropriate. So we're not powerless. And Gary often says that at ATS we may not be powerful, but we are not powerless. And he will explain how in the past and moving forward, we will use every available resource, every tool to our to our availability to fight for the lung health for all Americans.
Thank you, Irina. As you alluded to, there are limits to what we can do. So the ATS is a 501c3 organization, which means we're nonprofit in status in IRS, and there are limits on our advocacy. Essentially, the limits are we cannot oppose or endorse people for elected office, and we cannot make campaign contributions. However, we are free to comment on legislation, on regulation, on courts. We can even weigh in on ballot initiatives at state and local levels. So there's a lot of latitude for groups like the ATS to be involved in a very vigorous policy discussion, which is why I'm very glad that Dr. Rice is here with us today, because she has lived through the first Trump administration and had the unique experience of chairing the ATS Environmental Health Policy Committee and being sort of our spokesperson during the first Trump administration on environmental health and climate issues. So, Mary, I want to turn over to you. We've been through a first Trump administration before. I think it is fair to say the Trump administration will likely be unkind to some of the respiratory health priorities, particularly in climate change and clean air, compared to other administrations. What did you learn from your experience in the first Trump administration? What tactics did you use? What can we take from the first Trump administration to prepare us for advocacy during the second one?
Thank you, Gary. And let me just say that my comments during today's webinar are my own. I'm speaking as an individual and not on behalf of Harvard University. So during the last administration, there were many attempts to scale back clean air and climate rules, and to remove scientific experts from environmental regulatory panels, and to complicate and slow down the EPA process for environmental regulation. And yes, Gary, you and I were very busy during those 4 years, submitting public comments, speaking at public hearings, publishing editorials, submitting amicus briefs in court cases to explain not only what the research has shown on how pollution affects public health, but also defending the regulatory review process itself and explaining why it's so important for agencies like the EPA to review the entire body of scientific evidence in its rulemaking with the guidance of external expert advisory panels, which may include members of the American Thoracic Society. And in reflecting on those 4 years, the ATS and other groups, we were able to effectively push back on a lot of policies that were unfavorable for clean air, including attempts to interfere with how the EPA uses scientific evidence in its rulemaking. And I would say that while we didn't see a tightening of national ambient air quality standards under the last administration, we also didn't see a loosening. And I hope and expect that we can be similarly resilient in the second Trump administration. And you asked me what lessons I learned, and I would highlight 2 things. One, stay on mission. The mission of the ATS is to accelerate global innovation in the advancement of respiratory health through multidisciplinary collaboration, education, and advocacy. That is what we do. That is our mission. And we are experts in respiratory health. And so it's within our scope to promote efforts, whether it's through our care of patients or through local and national policy advocacy to advance respiratory health. And in order to do this, we need to engage publicly on these issues, as we have done during every previous administration. And my second lesson that I would highlight is that we need to speak clearly and plainly. The world needs the perspective of respiratory health experts. So we need to avoid language that might come across as political. Nobody wants impaired lung health. And I think most people do not want policies that are based on flawed science. But what people may hear in the news can be very misleading. And so as experts, we need to be very clear about what the evidence shows and what it means for respiratory health of kids and adults.
Thank you, Mary. I'm encouraged and heartened, and I want to lay down a couple of place markers of some areas where I think the ATS should use our voice and use our science. And the first one we've touched on is clean air and climate. We have a long and rich history of the ATS, both being members publishing the science that says clean air good, dirty air bad. We have participated in the rulemaking process across administrations. We've even gone to court to defend EPA's authority to issue rules to protect the American public from the dangers of air pollution and of climate change. And that's something that I think will continue to be a priority during the Trump administration. A couple new issues have popped up, and this one's a bit disappointing, is that we now have a discussion about vaccines. One of the greatest public health stories, not in just pulmonary, but of all health. And we see an administration that seems to be appointing a number of people in key health positions who, if aren't openly hostile to vaccines, are at least questioning. Now, in fairness, he's also nominated some people who I think are more positive on vaccines than others. But clearly there's a public discussion about vaccines that I think the ATS needs to be part of. Looking at the Trump administration, we also need to think about tobacco regulation, and that as a candidate, Trump said that he will save vaping. Not sure who he's saving it from, but I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration will probably not be as aggressive in implementing and proposing rules to regulate tobacco use. One of the core issues of the ATS, obviously, is research. And by that, I mean both NIH funding and research policy that supports effective, peer-reviewed, investigator-initiated research to better understand the causes, mechanisms of disease, and leads to better treatments and cures for our patients. Another issue that the ATS will continue to really be paying a lot of energy and attention to. So those are a couple issues that I just want to throw out there. Dr. Petrache, I'm curious, Irina, I'm curious. After the election results came in, I got a lot of emails from ATS members saying, Gary, what is the ATS going to do? I'm curious, did you get those emails too? And what were ATS members interested or concerned about?
Definitely, there were both personal interactions as well as through social media discussions. Our members have really manifested deep concern, especially about these issues that you are mentioning. And they are pertinent to the mission of the ATS. Like Mary said very eloquently, we are the most effective if we stay within our lane and we have a clear message. ATS has been for many years quite active in the area of tobacco control, as you imagine, since tobacco exposure has been one of the major drivers of chronic respiratory disease. And over the past couple of decades, with increasing use in vaping products, we have also seen an interest in understanding what this vaping exposure would do to the respiratory health of our children as well as adults. And as science emerges, both from an epidemiological standpoint as well as basic science research, it is clear that vaping is not safe. And what we can do is, if policies are endangering the respiratory health due to allowing more exposure, especially of children who are and have been quite astutely targeted by vaping commercializing companies, then we do have to step in and using science and evidence-based medicine to really advocate for and hold accountable the administration and lawmakers for any decisions that could endanger, again, the breathing and the health of our future generations. Regarding vaccines, again, ATS has always been supportive and engaging in promotion of vaccines as not only life-saving intervention that is so safe and has been really shown to be always the benefits of vaccination to far exceed any potential side effects that they might have. And they also save dollars. They save healthcare dollars. They decrease utilization of healthcare by decreasing the severity of illnesses that they are designed against. So we will continue to not allow any misinformation about vaccines to permeate the media channels, the information channels that our public is exposed to, and to really continue our vaccine initiatives. So we are working with several healthcare organizations in the country to increase the way access to vaccines and to allow, again, equitable vaccination and better dissemination of information about their effectiveness. We have been witnesses to the miracles that vaccines or a quick implementation of vaccines during the COVID pandemic has brought and has saved millions of lives. So we want to continue to advocate for their use. And finally, about research in general, I think there is a concern that funding for research in the United States might be under threat, and perhaps changes in health care agencies, especially those that fund research, will put in jeopardy the resources that are necessary to advance science and bring innovation in diagnosis, in treatment, in prognosis, of respiratory diseases, in pulmonary, in critical care, as well as in sleep, which are pertinent to our focus. And we will continue to advocate for research to be provided, the support for research to be provided, because if not, there will be a whole generation of scientists that could be put in jeopardy. And the American innovation that we're so well known for as leaders in the world can be threatened by any decrease in funding for these initiatives.
Thank you, Irina. Your comments touched on a number of things that I want to get some 2 cents in. First, during the first Trump administration, it is true that the Trump administration did propose significant cuts to NIH funding and other federal research program funding, but Congress rejected those cuts. And throughout the Trump administration, NIH saw increases all 4 years. And that's sort of a key point I want to raise, in that any decision that requires congressional approval, Congress has a role to play in. And I think we should keep that in mind. And yes, the Republican Party will control the White House, the House, and the Senate. But even within the Republican Party, there are a wide range of visions about key policy issues, and that there's bipartisan support for NIH funding and other federal research funding. So I think we can take solace in that while the president may propose, particularly in the area of research funding, it is the Congress that disposes. So they will be the ones making the key decisions on research policy. And we can sort of extend that to other issues as well, as we just saw from the recent challenge in getting even stopgap funding across the finish line in the House of Representatives. The Republicans had to rely on Democratic votes to pass that temporary funding bill. Republicans will start Congress with a 1-vote majority in this new Congress. So that means any major legislation will probably require some sort of bipartisan agreement on the House. Other thing to keep in mind is on the Senate side, Senator John Thune, who's the new majority leader of the Senate, has reiterated his commitment to preserving the filibuster. And that means for most issues that go through the Senate, the Democratic senators will have a say in things. So any action that requires congressional action will probably have to be done on a bipartisan basis. There's the obvious exception of the Budget Reconciliation Act that will primarily address taxes, spending, and will have less of an impact on some of the health issues that we care about. The other thing I should mention that comes up in the vaccine issues, I know I got a lot of emails and calls saying, hey, Gary, is the ATS going to oppose any administration appointee who is not supportive of vaccines? And the short answer is no. The ATS has taken an informal policy that we do not oppose appointees in new administrations. And the reasons for that are a couple. One, first of all, I don't think Congress is waiting with bated breath for the opinion of the American Thoracic Society on appointees for key cabinet level positions. So I don't think our opinion would have much impact. Second, even if we were successful in knocking out a candidate for, say, Secretary of HHS, I don't know that the next, or say EPA, I don't know that the next appointee would be any better. So it's, in my opinion, exercising a process of spending political capital on something that really doesn't have a real impact or lasting impact on the process. So the ATS will not be opposing any of the appointees for the upcoming administration. But the ATS does do stuff, and one of the stuffs that we have done in the past is to testify at congressional hearings. And Mary, I want to turn to you. You've had the pleasure of representing the ATS at congressional hearings before. What's that process like? Did you feel like it had an impact? Can we rely on you to do it again?
Do I have to answer that question, that last question on the webinar?
Last one was a little bit of a joke.
You know what, though? The answer is yes. And one point I do want to make during this webinar is that we are really going to need the broad engagement of the ATS scientific community. And this means that, and I hope this means that, Gary, in your office, that you're going to be reaching to members who might not have been involved in policy and advocacy before, who bring unique expertise, and that we're not only drawing on myself and other members of who are already very engaged through the Environmental Health Policy Committee or the Tobacco Action Committee or the Health Equity Committee, but others as well from around the country. And so I think it's really important for all of us at this time to recognize that we have a role to play and we have unique expertise to share that can have an impact on respiratory health, critical care, and sleep. So with that, let me tell you about one experience that I did have testifying during the last administration, the Trump administration. And it was about a new EPA rule that was proposed, and it was entitled Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. And while the word transparency sounds really good, it was really an attempt to administratively exclude scientific studies in the name of transparency from EPA rulemaking. So the way the proposed rule worked is it attempted to limit the EPA's ability to use studies by requiring near complete data transparency. And in doing so, that would exclude from consideration of EPA rules many important research studies that would include sensitive patient-level data, things like addresses and zip codes, birth dates, which are really critical for a lot of the research that we do, especially environmental health research. And that would potentially undermine the quality of environmental regulations because it would prioritize public accessibility over the scientific rigor of the research. And that rule was criticized and opposed broadly by the scientific community, including the ATS and also including former EPA officials. And I testified along with Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who was the former director of the NIEHS. And ultimately, that rule failed in the sense that it was only enacted at the very end of the last administration after many delays and very strong and very vocal opposition by the ATS and other groups. And then it was struck down quickly in the courts under the Biden administration. And I've testified before Congress in the past under previous administrations, mostly around topics related to clean air and climate regulation. And in those cases, I've discussed the health effects of pollution and the benefits of cleaner air on behalf of the ATS. But that last experience was different in that we were making arguments about why the science is important, not only about the health effects and what the science shows. But in my testimony that Gary, that you helped me prepare, I was sharing historical examples of tobacco science and policy. I was discussing how science can be verified and replicated and what systems are already in place. And another example is for environmental regulation. There's a historical precedent that for some environmental health studies that had a big impact on policy around particulate matter pollution and mortality, that there is a precedent for some of that being tested and verified through independent groups. The Health Effects Institute, which is co-funded by the automobile industry. And well, what was that like? Certainly, there were efforts during the Q&A with the members of Congress to muddle some of the arguments through misleading or confusing questions. But each time I tried my best to stay on topic and to speak clearly and plainly. And I found that generally I was able to steer clear of these kinds of efforts to confuse the arguments. And truthfully, every time I have testified on behalf of the ATS, I've come in feeling very prepared and very well supported, thanks to Gary and the DC office. And I really am confident that with the support of the ATS staff, we can do this again, Gary.
Thank you for those kind words. Let me pivot for a moment. Irina, I want to ask you a question about when the ATS is going to weigh in, but I want to preface the question a little bit by saying Trump is an unconventional politician. I think that's probably a fair and maybe understated way to describe him. We know he is going to tweet things that will be provocative, things that will, in some case, urge members to want some sort of response. I mean, just this week, he's said we're going to make Canada the 51st state, rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and has vaguely threatened to use a military action in Greenland. I don't think any of those are really serious, but looking back at the first Trump administration, he did make some comments that I think were more threatening in our space. Whether it's Muslim bans or mass deportation or family separation, a lot of things that I think ATS members felt threatened on and turned to the ATS looking for a response. Irina, the ATS has implemented a fairly recently new policy to help us decide when we're going to weigh in and where we might choose to maintain strategic silence. Do you want to describe that a little bit to us, Irina?
Absolutely. And I'm very grateful. And also, I've been honored to be part of the group that has worked on this policy. And with our executive committee, we were quite interested in positioning ATS to be the strongest it can be in implementing change. And this policy really addresses the very core issue of staying on point, sticking to the facts, and sticking to the mission of ATS to what we stand for our members. And it helps us really gauge on quite passionate topics. We each have our own opinions and ideological and political beliefs, and we have to respect those for our individual members. But as a society, we have to remember what we represent and what we can and cannot do. and to be effective in the end. So this policy helps us navigate especially very treacherous waters, very potentially polarizing views or thoughts, and helps us be thoughtful and create a climate within our society that is respectful, professional, and again stays true to the mission. For individual members, we want to remind everyone that we do have a newsletter that Gary's office publishes. Is the Washington letter that keeps us informed again of the facts. Many of the statements that we do put out there, they again reflect the ATS position, and it's related to facts rather than an emotional reaction that is, of course, human to have, but perhaps not pertinent to the society. We want to also remind our members that we as individuals have the ability to influence our state officials and Congress through our representatives in our states. And this is a position that ATS currently doesn't have the staffing, the resources to really influence state-level legislations, whereas we as members, as well as the local chapters of ATS, which have relative independence in the advocacy action that they can take, with help from Gary's office, that's another avenue in which advocacy efforts can be pursued.
Thank you, Irina. Mary, I want to pivot back to you. You've had the benefit of going through the first Trump administration we've alluded to. You've mentioned some of the tactics the ATS was involved in, court cases, testimony. You want to expand about what are some of the trump cards we have up our sleeve, pardon the pun, in pursuing policy that we think is good for patient health?
Well, I think we can expect a lot of efforts to roll back regulation. When using the example of environmental health, I think we can expect a lot of rollback attempts to roll back regulations that were issued under the Clean Air Act. Things like the recent rule for greenhouse gas emissions for cars and trucks, for power plants, for methane emissions from greenhouse gas facilities. And quite frankly, because these changes could be done through the executive branch, they do not require an act of Congress, and they may be hard to stop. So I think we need to be very tactful. And there are opportunities to have a real impact here, though. Because even issuing regulations takes time, and there's still a public input process that the ATS can and must participate in. And reflecting on the past Trump administration, we were very active in the public input process last time. And I really think that our points on respiratory health protections really resonated in several cases. And contributed to the failure of some of these efforts to weaken environmental protection. So we've been very successful in that in the past. And so I really do not think that we should be discouraged. And another side point I want to make is there has been, I think, an effort to kind of chill through the public discourse and threats of lawsuits, efforts to push back. And so I really want us to remain vigilant and just as active as we have always been in promoting respiratory health. And for rules that go too far, there's always the option to challenge rules in court, as we've done in the past. During the first Trump administration, the ATS participated in several amicus briefs on clean air and climate. And those legal tactics can in some cases strike down harmful rules, but I think also really importantly, they can buy time and delay implementation while progress is happening elsewhere through science.
Thank you, Mary. Just to expand on your comments on court action, the ATS is has filed amicus briefs in court cases, both suing the administration for when they should take action but have not, For example, we joined an amicus brief suing FDA for their failure to effectively regulate e-cigarettes. And that was a lawsuit that was filed by the American Academy of Pediatrics and other organizations. And the ATS supported that to try to spur action. We've also sued or joined court cases to defend agencies in their ability to regulate. For example, we have supported EPA's authority to regulate vehicle tailpipe emissions from cars and heavy-duty trucks. We've supported EPA's authority to issue carbon emission standards from power plants. We've even joined lawsuits to support agencies like OSHA and HHS on vaccine requirements for COVID vaccines. So we are both suing the administration to encourage them to do the right thing, and we're also joining lawsuits to protect and preserve the authority of federal agencies to do the public health protections that we think is necessary. Well, I think when people consider ATS advocacy, they probably think of Congress first and regulation second. I want to remind our members that we're fully engaged in all three branches of government, including the courts. And then the new territory that Irina mentioned is pivoting to states. It is true the Trump administration will probably not be positively active on areas that we care about, but that doesn't mean that policy in those areas has to come to a standstill. States and local governments are sort of the laboratory of a lot of policy, and a lot of policy experimentation happens at the state and local level. There's no reason the ATS working with other partner organizations can't play an active role in that. Just recently, the City Council of Denver was considering a ban on flavored tobacco products. And the ATS submitted comments in support of the City Council of Denver's efforts there. There'll be actions like that on climate change, on tobacco control. There is an opportunity for ATS members and the ATS as an organization, while remaining vigilant on federal policy, to pivot maybe some of our forward-looking actions to the state and local level. And to that, we've recently brought in staff to the Washington office who will help us do that. So while there might not be a lot of positive opportunities on some issues we care about at the federal level, that doesn't mean that we stop. And I think there's opportunities at the state level. I also want to mention that if you are interested in getting involved, there are lots of ways you can get involved with the American Thoracic Society through committees through service on ATS committees. There are several policy-related committees, including the Environmental Health Policy Committee that Dr. Rice formerly chaired, the Health Care Policy, the Research Advocacy Committee, the Tobacco Action Committee, and the Clinical Practice Committee, which deals with coding, billing, and other regulatory compliance issues. So a lot of ways that ATS members can get involved in the policy machinations of the American Thoracic Society. And I will also say, we've maybe taken a somewhat doom and gloom approach to the administration, the incoming administration. Some good stuff actually happened during the first Trump administration. I would have never predicted this, but if you'll recall, the federal age restriction for all tobacco products of 21 years age, that came during the Trump administration. Similarly, there was legislation called the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act that led to the phase down of F gases, which are powerful greenhouse gases. So phasing down the use of those across all industrial use, including metered-dose inhalers, is something that also happened during the Trump administration. I think there will be some opportunities for forward progress at the federal level, and we just need to be nimble and ready for those. I think we've probably hit most of the highlights we want to talk about on this discussion. Irina, let me pass it back to you. Any closing comments you want to make for today's podcast?
Yes, I would also like to end on a positive and hopeful note in that it is only united around science, around our mission, and having a voice, especially guided by experts such as those that I had the pleasure and honor to share this podcast with, that we can make progress. Being silent and blasé is not what scientists, researchers, and individuals who believe in the health and innovation in respiratory health are supposed to do. And I think ATS provides this platform and the ability to bring our voice and educate the public and continue to provide scientific breakthroughs and knowledge into respiratory health, and help the administration, help our legislators choose well and really be effective in their mission. And we can do that through membership into our professional society, through participating in the numerous advocacy committees that we have at ATS, and collaborating with our amazing staff to make our voices heard in the most effective way.
Well, thank you very much, Irina. I want to thank you and Mary for being on today's call. And I also want to thank the members of the ATS for the science that you do, for the clinical care that you provide, and for the advocacy that you do for lung health for all of society, both in the U.S. and internationally. So thank you for listening to today's webinar. And with that, look forward to working with everyone in the new year.